everybody, 4th and Long listeners, welcome to episode 3 of the 2019 season podcast. What a crazy weekend it was in Mini. Glad for everybody who could make out for that trip. That was a good time, and we got to watch football in a different atmosphere. So here we go again. Obviously, yeah, the weekend was better for some than others, fantasy wise, but hey, that's the way she goes. So, of course. If I did this by myself, it would just be a little weird. So Randy always pops in every podcast. So Randy, how you been?
Doing all right. Careful what you say about weird. I think that's a good way to describe us either way, whether there's one of us or two. So
Exactly. Yeah. So, um, without further ado, you know what? Let's just hop right into it because we got lots to talk about on this episode. So, we're gonna change things up here, Randy. Why don't we? Because sometimes we always get pissed off in fantasy, right? So let's start this episode off with a fantasy bust, and I'm gonna let you kick this episode off.
all right. Well, speaking of getting pissed off, I'm going to talk about your guy as a bust. I think you know who I'm talking about, Todd Gurley. Uh, so I guess the running back for the Rams. Should I call him on the Screaming Beavers or on the Vanilla Plus Shame? I don't know. That
Hey,
must be a bet from Minnie that got your name changed there or something. But uh, anyways, 14 carries, 43 rushing yards, and and nothing on reception. So that gives him a total of 4.3 points when he was projected 13.72. Not much, not much else to say about that. I mean, he's supposed to be a rock solid keeper running back. He should not be stinking up the joint like this. You can't be expected to get very far when your top running back doesn't even break 5 points. So that's a pretty easy pick for bust of the week from my point of view because running backs are supposed to be money makers.
yeah, well, as for the name change, my lawyer advises me not to discuss that. But yeah, it is what it is, and because of that, that name was changed due to the fact that the guy you just mentioned didn't perform on Sunday night. Ryan was only up by 14 points. Figure Todd Gurley could maybe do something against the Browns, and never did anything. And it's been frustrating having him this year. He's always been projected for plus 10 points each game, and it's just like you can't catch a break with this guy. They do not include him whatsoever when they get in the red zone, and I don't understand that. So we'll see, but definitely I thought about putting him as my fantasy bust. But the bust I've chosen is Kelvin Ridley from Global Warming. One catch, 6 yards. And I believe we talked about him last episode when we were praising Julio Jones and what happened the year before, where Calvin Ridley took a lot of those touches. Ryan should have had way bigger of a 14-point lead going into the last player in our matchup if Calvin Ridley did what he normally does, but he only got zero point 0.6 points. And Indy gives up the eighth fewest points to the wide receivers. But like we mentioned before, that Atlanta offense can put up points no matter what type of defense they're playing against. And he wasn't even hurt or in nothing. Didn't take plays off. He was just absolutely invisible. He's scored 12 touchdowns since the start of last season, which is tied for fifth amongst wide receivers. And to have that happen is can be costly, although it didn't cost Ryan. Normally a huge potential, but again, we'll see what happens here moving forward. And he's got another tough defensive matchup this week in Tennessee, who gives up the ninth fewest points to wide receivers. So we'll see what Ryan does, but I think Ryan doesn't have too many wide receivers to play with. So I think Calvin Ridley's still a play.
Yeah, and the other mention just about Ridley's day is that Matt Ryan. It's not like he didn't have a bad day. He's actually been steadily improving his fantasy scores at least week after week. So it's not like they have a stud running back and they're just feeding him the ball like they are in Minnesota with Delvin Cook. Matt Ryan's actually playing pretty well, and like you said, Ridley only 6 yards. That's a bust on any lineup, especially if he's a starter and you're supposed to get big points. Just like how I said, you're supposed to get big points from the running back. Well, you're supposed to get points from your wide receivers as well. At least you're supposed to get yardage out of them. So
Yeah, exactly. So, well, I think two pretty decent picks for busts of the week. We'll roll right into the highlight here, and I'll kick it off because I know um, what an afternoon that was when we were all sitting around chatting about it. But my fantasy player of the week is Mike Evans. He had 8 receptions, 190 yards, 3 touchdowns. It's basically 24 yards per reception for a total of 37 fantasy points. And I mean, against the Giants, who give up the most fantasy points to the wide receivers, which you should do, but I've just never trusted Tampa Bay's offense. And Mike Evans is usually top 10 wide receiver fantasy wise, but 37, that's even big. That's beyond big for him, especially with Jameis Winston at the quarterback. The last time he did something remotely close to that was October 28th of 18, where he had 179 yards. He's projected above 10 points for the rest of the season, so he's still going to give you a decent projections. But it's not going to be easy because he only plays 3 teams that are currently below the top 10 against wide receivers, and 3 of those are in his division: New Orleans twice and Houston. So tough defensive matchups moving forward for the rest of the year for Mike Evans. But you got to take points while you can, and I'm sure Dylan's just pumped about that. Dylan actually only won his matchup by 20 points. So if you even bring him down to a decent yardage day with maybe a touchdown, Dylan could have potentially lost that matchup. So this really gave him some breathing room. So Mike Evans, highlight of the week.
Yeah, for sure. That was definitely an amazing stat line as I was seeing it. I didn't get to watch that move itself. It wasn't uh, obviously, like you said, with Tampa Bay on there, it's not really a team. That's not really a team you pay attention to, even if you're watching fantasy and and trying to watch a bunch of fantasy players. That's not a team you watch. That's a team you just kind of you know they show the highlights once in a while, and you're like, oh look, there's another big play for Mike Evans. Oh look, there's another touchdown for Mike Evans. No, he's having a good game. And then you see the stat line, and it's like, wow, that was an amazing game that he put together that nobody saw.
Exactly. So who is your highlight of the week?
Well, I'm going to go with the quarterback for this week, which I know we don't always do because quarterbacks are supposed to get decent points. I'm going to go with Russell Wilson.
Yeah, I figured you'd be going with him. Yeah, he had a big day. He had a big day.
Yeah, he did everything for Seattle in that game. Um, like he scored every touchdown either through the air or on the ground. There wasn't much of a running game on that day. In fact, his 51 rushing yards was only a couple of yards behind the starting running back Carson. And I guess a lot of these points kind of came all at once. He wasn't having that great of a game until the fourth quarter, when the Saints, surprisingly, with Teddy Bridgewater at quarterback, were up 27-7 in the fourth quarter. And suddenly Wilson just decided, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and reach that 400-yard mark, put a couple touchdowns in, run a couple touchdowns in. I mean, like, this is kind of where, for certain quarterbacks, the lack of a running game actually helps them fantasy-wise. And for Russell Wilson, that seems to be the case. They haven't had a good offensive line for a couple years, haven't had a good running game since Beast Mode was at his height. And yet, Russell Wilson continues to be a good fantasy option, mostly because he's picking up these garbage points and these fourth quarter comeback points. Now the comeback came up short this time, but just the fact that he pretty much turns it to he turns it up a notch in the fourth quarter when they're down. That's kind of when you get your most points out of Wilson, and it's been that way for a while. So he's my and then obviously being on the opposite end of my matchup, being Selby's quarterback, I had a pretty well-rounded game, and yet this Russell Wilson this performance pretty much canceled out both my running backs, and that's a big fantasy highlight when your quarterback can do that for you.
Well, I know we were watching the board down there, and man, we finally woke up and really, started really looking at the matchups and realized, holy shit, Randy lost by like less than a point. So it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's a different story. Sunday night screwed me on that one too.
Yeah. Well, Russell Wilson can look to have another big matchup when he should feast on Arizona's defense Sunday afternoon. Um, Randy, just keep it going to top this category off. Who's your surprise player of the week?
Well, my surprise player of the week is kind of related to your highlight of the week. Jameis Winston was my surprise,
Hmm.
and well, for the reason that we mentioned, nobody really expects it. He's the quarterback for the old dirty bastards. Uh, 380 yards, three touchdowns, only the one pick, which is actually a pretty good line for him. 30 and a half points when he was projected to be just under 23. Now, of course, the Giants aren't always a very difficult matchup, as you pointed out. But like I said, no one expects Winston to get 30 points. I mean, against any matchup, you almost expect him to find a way to blow it even against lesser teams. And this certainly wasn't expected when that trade happened earlier in the week.
We talked about that.
When that trade was Winston and Trubisky, and of course, Trubisky is a bit of a disappointment fantasy-wise this year, but that trade was mostly about upgrading the running back position. Not, the quarterbacks were mostly just the fact that, that Jake didn't really want to play Trubisky. He was looking for an upgrade, but it's the kind of thing because he had Big Ben and Big Ben's out for the year, so he just wanted a better player to fill in for the year. And guess what he got? He ended up getting a player that helped him win, and in a pretty tough matchup. I mean, I'm just looking at the matchup here. Kelly put up 101 points. That's usually pretty challenging. You gotta really, certainly when your starting quarterback goes out, you really gotta pull out all the stops to beat that.
Mm-hmm. That was an interesting. I mean, we were talking about that, and then it was like, okay, Winston threw a touchdown, and then like you said, oh, there's another one, and oh, look, he did another one, and it's like, Jake was thinking, there's no way I'm going to come back and beat Kelly, and then all of a sudden it was just tick, 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 tick the whole afternoon, and a lot of that was because Jameis Winston had a great afternoon, and therefore Mike Evans had a great afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
For my fantasy surprise is Zach Ertz, and you wouldn't think he would be in the surprise category, but I'm putting him here as a surprise on the shittier surprise. 6.4 points, 4 receptions, 64 yards. In the first 3 games this year, he has less targets, less yards, less receptions, and still 0 touchdowns as he did last year. So he's actually trending downwards if you looked at every stat category. And the why is he my surprise? He's only had 1 red zone target this year that was inside the 10-yard line for Philadelphia, and he's had 6 from inside the 20. I don't really count the 20 from the red zone, but I mean, if you got pushed back penalty-wise, there's potential there as well. But the Eagles have been in the red zone 12 times, and Ertz has got nothing. Now, if you think back to last year, how many times did Nick Foles just push the ball into Ertz in the red zone? Like, he really lit on fire in that. He was like clutch in that red zone. And I think he's a stud player, but he's playing way below his value on what he should be. And if you're Jerry, you got to be a little upset. I mean, he is playing a 2 tight end roster. It's almost to the point where, do you get rid of Ertz? Do you move him onto the bench and play somebody else until he has a better game? I just think Zach Ertz is surprising me because he's not even close to being in the top 2 tight ends, in my opinion.
Yeah, like I think he might be holding on to one of them for trade bait. So if anybody wants to either upgrade their tight end position, or if they're desperate for one, like say an injury or something, definitely look to Jerry to offer you one because, like you said, even though Ertz is surprised that he hasn't done well, and I'm just looking at the stats for the Thursday game. The Thursday game is on as we're recording this, and at this moment, the third quarter had just started getting underway a little bit. Ertz is leading the Eagles in receptions and yards, but Goddard got the touchdown. So that's almost exactly to your point. He can get a few yards, but the touchdowns are going to someone else, and that usually will translate into red zone looks. And I see Goddard only has 16 yards receiving, so he got the red zone look instead of Ertz, and that's a big problem because, like you said, Ertz was a big target in the end zone, and that's a big reason why he's so high up on the tight end fantasy list, and it's just not happening for him this year.
Well, and exactly because if you look at it, what is the value of the tight end? It's praying you get a 1 to 10 yard touchdown. That's
Yeah.
giving you 6 to potentially 7 points, and that's not bad because most tight end projections are usually below 10 points. So if you can
Mm-hmm.
snag a touchdown, you're pretty much ahead of the game because that's the bonus you're gonna get, hoping the other guy's tight end doesn't get one. But when your tight end doesn't do anything, it's frustrating, and especially if this isn't like some random tight end we're talking about. Zach Ertz is one of the best tight ends in the game, and
Yes.
has yet to catch a touchdown this year. And like you said tonight, he doesn't have one either so far. But that would be 4 games where he's gotten 0 touchdowns. So
That's right.
a little bit of some. That's like
Yeah, and like even at the beginning of the year, you're wasting a pretty high draft pick on this tight end. And I'm just gonna quickly check here and see. No, Ertz was not one of Jerry's keepers, but
no.
still, you know, certainly he's certainly in that range. Him and Kelsey are both in that range of maybe he's a tight end keeper. Some people might keep him, but yeah, like he's almost in that range. And then to be that disappointing, you know, can you imagine? I'm not sure what round he was drafted in, but it was obviously much higher than other tight ends.
Yeah. So
Well, you have gotten for that tight end if you just pick someone else.
exactly. So no, I just figured with the surprise segment, it doesn't always have to be like, oh my god, I can't believe this guy scored 500 points. Sometimes the surprise could be, man, this is kind of frustrating, and I'm surprised they're not doing that well. So took a little different view on that. So that kind of tops off our top 3 categories. For our news segment section, where the last 2 have talked actually about some news, we took a little bit of a break here, and we went back to what one of the comments was. Were I really miss when you guys talked about the teams and the matchups. So when there isn't really a big news segment, what we were thinking of doing is randomly taking a team from each of our divisions and kind of breaking them down. So that's what we're going to do today. So I guess I can start it off. So for the random team I've selected in our division to discuss, I've chosen the Devil Raiders, GM'd by Kelly, and just a little bit of how they got to the 2-1 record currently. It's kudos to Kelly. I'm sure he's pumped. It's been a while since he's come out the gate that hot. He's averaging about 106 points a week, and had Jake not crept up in that afternoon, like we just kind of talked about, Kelly could be the only undefeated team in the league. He's beat Texas Walker, who's currently in 8th. He beat me in week 2, and I'm currently 7th, but lost to Jake in week 3, who's currently in 10th position. And actually, he was only projected to beat Jake, who he lost to. So interesting the way he's kind of pulled out some upsets, technically. One of his highlights, hands down, and I think we're not. I mean, if you looked at this guy's teams, it's easy to see off the page. New England's defense, currently 61 fantasy points. That's the best defense by 20 points. Mind you, 2 of the 3 games were against their bullshit division, as you all know how I call it, Miami and the Jets. But still, 61 fantasy points. That's more than I think probably a few top wide receivers and running backs. And to get that from a defense is unreal. So great pick there, and I think they'll continue to do that. Another highlight on this guy's team is one of his running backs, Aaron Jones, who's having a decent night tonight as well. And he's definitely waking up in the run game for Green Bay. He's got 35 points in the last 2 games with 3 touchdowns, and he's got about 8 so far tonight. So he's definitely one of the other highlights on this guy's team. Some of the lowlights to talk about on Devils Raiders, just quickly. Obviously, devastating news with the Drew Brees injury. You take a quarterback of that caliber, you expect big things, only to have him hurt week 2, which pissed me off that I couldn't even beat him without Brees. So obviously his team is balanced enough to withstand an injury. And he didn't draft a backup. So he had to make that move in week 3 that we talked about, where he acquired Matt Ryan. So keeping Breeze on the IR could be good, as Breeze is not a season-ending injury. He should be back in about 6 weeks, I believe. So that'll be definitely a key. But when you get that caliber, definitely affects the roster. That could be. And just a couple things to round out here before I let you go. Looking forward to the year for this guy. It'll be interesting to see when Breeze comes back. Who do you play? Because, like you mentioned before, Randy, Matt Ryan's actually having a pretty good year. Can New England defense continue the dominance that they're on? Will his wide receivers have games at the same time? It seems like Odell, Michael Thomas, and we'll say Gordon and Robinson just seem to be flip flopping games. They never piece it together so far. So we'll see if they can get that going when it matters. He's projected to win 7 of the next 10 matchups to finish the year, and if he was able to do that, he'd finish with a 9-4 record. So definitely playoff bound, potentially division leading. And will getting rid of Marlon Mack hurt him? That's the question I want to know. His running back depth is pretty weak after Aaron Jones. Mind you, Kareem Hunt comes back in week 10, but I think Chubb is just a beast in Cleveland, so I don't think Kareem Hunt's going to be Kareem Hunt, we all know. So we'll see if that Marlon Mack trade hurt him, but definitely just highlighting a team. And Kelly, you got a good thing going here, so we'll see how it pans out.
Yeah, just as another comment about at least certainly, I don't really want to get into Kelly's head per se, just for other reasons, but I think once Breeze comes back, maybe Matt Ryan might be good trade bait to improve his running back position. That might be his plan with that. But I will also make a comment. Good on Kelly for picking up my boy Jason Witten. I see he put him in the starting lineup this week. So I'm a fan of anyone who recognizes the greatness of Jason Witten. That's for sure. But definitely good to see Kelly doing well this year. Especially that he has had some stinky years. I think last year was a tough year for him. But so I'm going to go with into my division, the AFC, and I'm going to take a look at someone who also has a 2-1 record, although a little bit of a different team than what you were looking at Kelly. I'm going to look at Clueless.
Okay.
And I'm just going to be looking at. This was a strange one for me because as I'm looking at the record, he's the only one with a winning record, but a negative point differential. So of course I'm looking at how he got there. Week 1 he played me, and I pretty much had a week there in week 1 where nothing went wrong for me. Everything went right. So I put up 153 points. So you can just write that one off as a loss. That's not his fault. Although I did make a comment in the rankings about how Lamar Jackson was the only player on that team that showed up that week. Pretty near got half his points. But then in week 2 and 3, he played Man Bear Pig and Misfits and kind of got a little bit of a help. Man Bear Pig only put up 78 points and Misfits only put up 77. So it's pretty easy to be 2-1 when your opponent doesn't show up for 2 weeks. But that being said, I'm going to go through the team and I'm going to explain about how it doesn't necessarily look like that's the only way that Clueless is going to win games. I think this might be a good season for him because the future actually looks pretty bright here for Clueless. So I'm going to start, of course, with Lamar Jackson. Had week 1 and week 2 had really great games, put up 43 and 33 fantasy points respectively. Week 3 was a bit lower, only had 19. But of course, we've talked about him before on the podcast about how this kid has really got this Baltimore offense really humming on all cylinders, doing really well that way, putting the points up. I also like I like this wide receiver core that he's got. Cooper Kupp seems to be, at least in the early going, seems to be the number 1 receiver in LA right now, which really hurts me. I'm debating whether to even start Randy Wood in my flex or for this week. I don't think. I think Kupp can be relied on pretty well. Devontae Adams, no touchdowns so far this year, But of course, as I look at the Thursday game, is what's going on now. It's about halfway through the third quarter, and Adams has 167 yards already. So I think look for Adams to continue to improve. He doesn't need the touchdown this week, but he will get the touchdowns. The points will be up there, and that's a really dangerous wide receiver core. David Johnson has been solid at the tight end or at the running back position. Sorry, not really the real great fantasy stud that he was a couple years ago, but still very solid. He's getting lots of work, and he's getting a few touchdowns here or there as well. So he's looking good. Really kind of solid at most positions. Really, not the best defense and not the best kicker. Although Denver does have potential at defense, especially if their offense continues to improve. I'm not really too worried about this team at all. I mean, even at the tight end position, this Darren Waller guy out of Oakland is a pretty good player.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not worried at all about this team, especially since I already played him once. I get him again in week 8. We'll see how the lineups look and how the bye weeks look at that point. But I'm looking forward to that rematch, because I anticipate he'll have more than a few wins. He won't be getting easy ones, so the future looks pretty bright here. I'm expecting Poulis and myself to challenge for the top spot in the AFC, and that's my look at this team.
Yeah, no, he's positioned himself well. Lamar Jackson is definitely having himself a great start to the year. Glad to see Cooper, like you mentioned, Cooper Kupp. Glad to see him not concussed, walking around the field. So obviously he's been doing very well. He has 3 wide receivers who are over 200 yards receiving already. So, they're definitely, he's got the guys that are getting targets. And with just a quick note, because you've already mentioned his team, what's interesting is John Brown from Buffalo almost has double the amount of points that Devontae Adams has. So it's just interesting how, does that get into your head when you start looking at those numbers, and maybe he makes a bad play? Not to say that Allen will, but sometimes, hey, we're all ranking slaves and number sluts. So we'll see where that goes, but definitely clueless. I mean, being 5th in the league, definitely has positioned himself well. Yeah, we just figured we would try something where if there isn't really a big news topic, we can maybe go back to what was familiar with some of you guys last year, was discussing matchups and teams, and we figured this way we can highlight them, and every week we move on, it's going to be a different story, because there's a few, most people are 2-1 or 1-2, but next week we might highlight a different team, and we'll see how this last week's matchup affected their rankings. So yeah, we just thought we'd throw that in there so you guys could get highlighted and see our views on what we think. So no, that's
Go
ahead.
Quickly, just get your opinion on. I saw there's even another trade still on there. This seems to be the year of the trade so far, so I just wanted to get your opinion on that. I know I already kind of know your opinion on trades, but I thought just let the guys that listen to the podcast know what your opinion on all these trades are.
Well, we left off with the Matt Ryan trade, so it's a good thing you brought that up. We have 2 trades since then, so let's just start with the first one. We had Old Dirty Bastards receives John Ross, the 3rd and a 5th round for Jalen Samuels, and a 4th round to Dylan. Seems to be a decent trade. Jake needed definitely a wide receiver upgrade, which I think he got. It'll depend. They're playing the Steelers this week, so it should be interesting to see. They're projecting big things for Dalton, so we'll see if Ross can really get involved in that. And as for the other trade, this one Corey, I know you're going to listen, and I know Ryan's listening. Corey, I think you were still hungover from the weekend, because I think you made a bad trade. You should have definitely got a pick on top of that as well. Saquon Barkley, yes, he's hurt, but you can't think just for this season. You've given up a generational player that you could have had for a very long time, being him and Kamara moving forward. I think if anything, if you were going to get rid of that to upgrade your wide receivers, I think you should have added some picks into that as well, because Tyreek Hill is although a great receiver, I think you can get any type of receiver, but you can't always find a Barkley. I don't know. What's your thought on that trade?
Yeah, that was a strange one for me too, just because of, like you said, for the future year. I mean, like both guys are out at the present, so as to whether who comes back first or whether you need help or not, um, it's a very strange one. Maybe he thinks Tyreek Hill will be his wide receiver of the future for years to come. Maybe he thought that Kamara will carry the load, but man, if you've got two, and I know, Cook's having a good start to the year, and pairing him with Zeke, man, I'm feeling really good about my running back. So if you've got two really good running backs like that, man, you keep them together as long as you can.
Yep, I agree. But hey, they're both 2-1, and I'm 1-2, so maybe they know something I don't know. Um, but yeah,
Well,
no, there's still lots
well,
of
one thing I like all the action with these trades. I like that.
exactly. So I know there's been lots of
I think
trade
gives
off.
everyone a little more bravery to kind of offer up their own trades and try to improve their own teams however they can. A couple of draft picks this year flipping around too, and next year at the draft, won't know whose turn it is. We're definitely going to have to let the computer figure that one out because we got third rounds and fourth rounds and 10th rounds and eighth rounds going back and forth all over the place. We don't know who's going to draft next.
Exactly. So no, yeah, no, definitely lots of action, and every time there is a trade, you can trust us that we'll highlight that. So that kind of concludes this episode for episode 3 here, guys. Hopefully everything's working out, and best of luck to your matchups this weekend. I know I'm going to be in a tight one, but hopefully we can get back on the 500 train. So, Randy, anything before we go?
Nothing else here. Just have a good week, guys.
All right, take care, everyone. We'll talk to you later.